Well, good morning, everyone. See, that was a test. I don't mind a little bit of feedback, so when I ask you questions, I like to hear the answers, right? How many people in this room are developers? Oh, it's more than I thought. I did a claims talk last year, developing with claims, and they asked me to do an IT Pro talk this year, and I was warned, do not launch Visual Studio in an IT Pro talk. So I promised I wouldn't. But I did use Consolas font on the About Me slide, so that makes us both happy, right? My name is Paul Schaeflein. As I said, I'm a developer in SharePoint, doing this quite a while. I'm talking today about claims identity or claims authentication. Lots of confusion, lots of capabilities, lots of possibilities. So I want to try to help smooth out that road bit a little bit today. I've done training mostly for developers, for just about anything SharePoint. Big hockey fan. Got my Blackhawks mouse pad here. So for another couple weeks, we're still the champs until the cup happens. I was awarded the MVP by Microsoft. Thank you. I mostly do user groups. I see one SharePoint Saturday shirt here in the front. I occasionally do a couple of those. So if you have run a user group or know of a user group, you want a speaker, find me afterwards. I'll be happy to try to arrange a time to come out and give a talk. Doesn't have to be this one. It can be just about anything. We're done here just before lunch, and then I will be in the TLC, the SharePoint TLC booth in the exhibit hall after lunch. So if you have questions and I'm not here, you want to find me, come on down there, look for me there. I'd be happy to answer, or at least try to answer your questions then. Oh boy, fancy. See, I didn't do this. Oh, hey, all the SharePoint folks in the room, right? Have you signed up for the conference yet? The SharePoint conference to be at is the Microsoft SharePoint conference in Anaheim, October 6th, or 3 to 6. Okay, there you go. Now let's move on. So I want to talk about claims. And as I said, it's a very confusing topic. There's lots of new terms, lots of new concepts. And in typical SharePoint fashion, the word claims is used to have multiple meanings. So I want to talk a little bit about what claims are, throw out some words and define them so you know what I'm talking about. So when we get later on, we understand. So if you've seen this before, if you've been to any claims talk before, you've seen some of these slides and these concepts. Just bear with me. So first thing we're going to talk about is identity, right? This whole concept here, the primary thing that claims brings to the table is identity. And so identity, as we're saying, is a set of attributes that describe a user. Most commonly, their login name or their email address. First name, last name, right? And so we have this thing called a claim, which is information about that user, right? Well, claim, attribute, what's the difference, right? We'll talk a little bit about that, but I just want to make sure we understand that we're talking about identity means we have a user of some type. And then there's two other words here that I want to separate, right? Authentication is a process to prove you are who you said you are. And authorization lets me do things based on who I am. SharePoint does not do authentication. It never has. SharePoint does not do authentication. You can do Windows NT authentication, you can do forms-based authentication, you can do claims-based authentication. You never do SharePoint-based authentication. However, SharePoint is all about authorization, the people picker. We all love the people picker, right? I'm going to break it today, so SharePoint does all kinds of authorization. So make sure you keep those two. And I put those abbreviations in there. And in fact, when I did this later on, I have a slide, I put the word auth-n in there, and I actually did it wrong. I was reviewing it this morning, so I ran over and thank you to the technical folks, got me all hooked up. And so we have a user identity, we have a set of claims, right? But remember I said we have attributes about a person, but we're using the word claim. And why is that? Because somebody is claiming that this information is correct, right? So if you go to Facebook, you see, yeah, there I live in Chicago. Well, I really don't live in Chicago. I live in a suburb of Chicago. So despite popular conception, I cannot go to the city of Chicago and vote because the Board of Elections doesn't trust Facebook. Right. Well, there's a new sheriff in town starting yesterday, I think, so who knows what the rules are now. But anyways, that's the concept, right? So this all boils down to, in order, if you're working with SharePoint, you're configuring SharePoint, you have applications that are running on SharePoint, does claims help you? Well, that all depends on who you trust to prove identity. So this whole claims-based authentication, or this SharePoint and claims, the primary thing that you have to figure out is who do you trust to provide identity. So I was all excited. I've been working with SharePoint permissions for a long time, wrote a lot of code on it, working on claims. I thought this is cool. I really dig it. I get it. I understand it. And I go into a client to talk about claims, and they said, oh, well, we're going to set up an extranet, and we're going to trust our partner's Active Directory. They're going to put up ADFS. It's going to work great. So we're on our way. We're moving down the path. And then they said, well, I want to know who the users are that they allowed in. I said, well, you don't know who they're, that's the whole point. They give you a claim that says allowed to log in. If you trust them, anyone they say can log in can log in. And they say, oh, whoa, we can't have that. We need to know who the users are. And I said, well, then you don't trust them. So I have a track record. I have had more client engagements in which I talked them out of claims, in which I've actually implemented claims. But you get the point, right? If you need to have that control, then you aren't trusting someone else to do the control for you. However, I'm hoping that some of you actually do trust other people and you want to know more about claims, so I've gone through and I've set up some, and we'll go through that. All right, so now that we've talked about claims, we're moving on into some more SharePoint terms. And the next term is identity provider. In the .NET world, us developers, we use the provider model a lot. It helps us do lots of different things. And the idea here is SharePoint doesn't do authentication. They just say, hey, give me your identity, and I'll work with it. So an identity provider is some system that can issue a token with a standard industry standard format. That token issuer has a database or some type of storage of user accounts. Active Directory, LDAP, database, whatever, right? It doesn't have to be Active Directory. You can do the SiteMinder from whatever that other companies, and I seriously forgot who it was, Oracle or CA, right? So thank you. So they have their own storage of users. They do whatever they do, right? It doesn't matter. If they can issue a token, they could be an identity provider for SharePoint. That token issuer must do the authentication in whatever format they want to. It could be a password. It could be some biometric things, smart card, whatever. It doesn't matter. As long as you trust them that they're going to give you a valid identity, we move on, right? And then that token issuer can decide what attributes they're going to put into that token. Usually it's group membership or role membership. It could be other things as well, right? Again, in SharePoint, you choose who to trust and then which attributes or claims you're going to accept from them. And I'll show you how we can do all that. Here is an example of the attributes that are put into a token, right? So you can see here the most popular is some type of email address because that's become the default unique identifier for people, right? There aren't two people with the address paul@shafline.net. At least I hope not. So this particular one has two attributes. One is the email address, and then the second one is the group, and there's a list of groups. This token came from ADFS, so ADFS is just spitting out the SID for the group, which isn't very helpful to humans, but perhaps it is to the system. I'm going to double click on this here. Whoa. Let me go back there. I embedded this so that I could call it up later. This is the complete token. And you can see here there's a lot to it. It's not just, so here's the snippet that I pulled out, but you can see it's got a lot of stuff in here, including the X509 cert, the public key of the cert that was used to sign the token so we can verify it wasn't tampered with, right? So a SAML token is not a small thing. We don't want to be putting every attribute on the planet in the token for people. It's not a replacement for your profile. And in fact, SharePoint has a profile system, and you can log in, right? You click on your name, and you can type in your profile. That's still valid. You don't want to populate that from the token if you don't need it. All right, let me see if I can get back to the slides here. So another common misconception is that that big SAML token is passed on every request, and it's not. So here's a wonderful, this is my style of graphic, because I'm graphically inept. And the Patterns and Practices group has a book out, that's on the bottom left there, the Claims-Based Identity and Access Control Guide. Wonderful guide, has nothing to do with SharePoint. However, there is a release due out very soon that has 2 new chapters on it, on single sign-on and one on SharePoint. So I'm talking to the guys. They told me it was going to be released for Tech Ed, but I haven't seen it. So if it's not there now, it will be very shortly. And so this picture, what I want you to see in here is that what ends up happening is the browser gets a fedauth cookie. Federated authentication. So what ends up happening is you connect to SharePoint. SharePoint says, who are you? Well, you don't have an identity, so who's your identity provider? You pick one, and then the browser gets redirected to that identity issuer, in this case, ADFS. A token is then generated and passed once to SharePoint's token service, and the SharePoint's token service then gives you a regular HTTP cookie, right, with the fedauth information that's needed, and that's all that's used on subsequent requests. So that big massive token is not passed on every single request, but it is passed in at every login. So if you have the bandwidth to be sending 15, 20K at 9 a.m. Monday morning and support it, that's great. But it seems silly to have all that information in there. So when you're mapping the claims, only take the ones you need. So does this picture make sense? It's not automated, but I think we're all smart enough to figure it out without the automation, right? At least that's my goal. So finally, we get into something in SharePoint. What does this mean? So what I did is I put up the old version and the new version. How many people here have experience with the older versions of SharePoint? MOS or WSS? Yeah, I thought most people, right? So before we had Windows NT and we had forms-based. And if you wanted both on the same content, you had to extend the web application to another zone, which had another web.config and another IIS website and all that other fun stuff, and you had to do it separately, right? So now in SharePoint 2010, we have two different authentication methods. Classic mode means just like it used to be, and claims mode, which brings in this new SAML 1.1 WS-Fed. That's the industry standard mumbo jumbo that basically means claims. Right? And now zones, you're allowed to have multiple authentication modes per zone, which means I can have a single zone that allows Windows NT and FBA and or identity providers. Right? When you provision your web applications, you want the default zone to be the most secure. So in general, your default zone might only be Windows NT for your internal authoring, or for if it's an extranet, your internal users coming in through Windows NT, make that the default zone. Right? Now that doesn't mean you have to use a different zone for another authentication type, but what I'm saying is if your default is identity provider, and then you extend it to another zone, and the other zone is Windows NT, you've done it backwards, right? This is primarily going to help because the search crawler requires NTLM. So if you need to tell search to crawl a different zone, now you have a search configuration issue, and I can't help you. Search is a text box and a go button. I stole that from Todd Bleecker, so that's all it is, right? So just long story short, provision the default zone with NT. If you need to have a different zone with different requirements, that may be fine. So does this all make sense to you here? And there's another fancy picture that I've stole that shows how this can all work. I can have many different identity providers, and all of them spit out a SAML token, and under the covers, SharePoint creates the SP user object based on that token. So I can have a single zone, which means I can have a single URL, which means if I'm at work, it's the same URL as if I'm at home. Or I can tell all my customers on the extranet to use the same URL if I wish. I don't have to have all kinds of different things to teach them, right? It becomes much simpler. And so I'm going to show this to you, the multi-auth zone. I need to flip. Come on, there we go. Wrong button. So I've gone to a web application to sign in, and this web application has more than one zone, more than one identity or authorization method. So I get this lovely screen, right? Fortunately, you can get a developer to make it look pretty. Sadly, most developers are graphically challenged, so you might have to get two people involved, one to make it pretty and one to deploy it. So my web application, I've configured 3 different identity providers. And these names that show up in here, you can configure. When you do the PowerShell to add it, and yes, you have to do PowerShell, you can give it a name, and that's what shows up in this box. So you can customize these. So what I've done is ADFS 2.0 on the same domain as the SharePoint is running in. I've also done a different domain using ADFS 2 on a different domain, and I've trusted that. So it could be an extranet partner, if you will. And then I've also have a custom STS that one of the patterns and practices guys wrote to take an OpenID and translate that into the WS-Fed that's required by SharePoint. So I can, if the internet works, I can log in with an OpenID provider. So just to show you how this works, we'll go through, and I'm going to choose the internal ADFS. I'm a developer. I don't know how to do certificates, so you're going to see this a lot because I don't know how to install it and make this go away. You guys probably do it in your sleep, but that's all right. So I'm going to go through. I'm using self-generated certs on all these. So what I've done is I've told SharePoint I want to log in using ADFS for the same domain that I'm in, contoso.com. And so SharePoint redirected me to the ADFS server. Now, I went into the ADFS servers, the IIS, and I turned off integrated NT authentication because I want it to stop here so that you can see it says demo2010.contoso.com. Otherwise, it would just blink and you wouldn't see anything happen, right? So you can use ADFS 2.0, and you can have it automatically log in the user based on their desktop network login. That still works. The browser blinks, but they're not prompted to log in. Another feature us developers like to do is domain admin for everything. Yes. So please don't tell me I did it wrong. I know that. I'm a developer. So now when I'm logging in, ADFS 2.0 is validating my credentials. Well, it's trying to authenticate, so I guess we'll have to wait till it says you're not allowed. What will end up happening is then, I'll go through these steps as we configure an ID provider in a bit, but ADFS is going to validate who I am, look to its configuration and say all the claims that are supposed to be packaged in, put them in a token, and send me back to SharePoint. And now it's long, so admin is straight short, right? And I'm in. So in the upper right, it says administrator at contoso.com because that's the token I've done there. So one thing I always have to, a lot of people, I get in here, right? What claims did I get? I can turn on Fiddler and grab that token if I want. That's probably what you guys would do. What I did is I wrote a web part that'll just enumerate all the claims. And it's available on the blog, and it'll be in all on the stuff here. So let me just show that to you. If I go to my pages library, and I aptly named a page called Claim Viewer. And so here's a web part that is simply enumerating all the claims that were sent to SharePoint from this identity provider. The claim type is a big, long string that looks like it's a namespace, if you will. The first one says it's, I want you to look at, oops, wrong mouse. I want you to look at this one here. See, there's original issuer, and this one right here says ADFS 2.0 server. So that is the only piece of information that was returned from ADFS to SharePoint is that one claim that says email address is administrator@contoso.com. And when I configured this identity provider in SharePoint, I said the identifying claim is the email address. If you want to use the row index in your database because it's some custom thing, you want it to be ID equals 3, you're more than welcome to do that. That's how you would just map your claim. The identifier is that claim there. And you see there's a bunch of other tokens that are put in there by SharePoint. What I'm going to do now is switch and log in with a different identity, and we'll see the difference in claims. So I'm going to log in as this other domain, again, self-generated cert. And now if I've configured my networking correct, I will get a similar looking page with a different name across the top. Don't we just love demos? Oh, yes. It looks the same. But notice this says lt-vert.com up here. So I'm going to log in again as domain admin because that's what I do. Admin. And see, I'm going to type it with an extra R this time. And again, ADFS packages the tokens, does what it's supposed to do, and then sends me back to SharePoint. Now I should get to the same page. Notice in the sign-on in the upper right, says administrator@ltvert.com. And now here's my trusted provider right here, so the claim is the same, right? So I've logged in with two different providers onto this screen. Make sense? Same auth. The URL is the same. It's the same invalid certificate according to IE. Everything is the same. Makes it easier for my users. Does it make sense? All right, I'm going to assume everyone said yes because I couldn't hear any of you. I'm sure it must be the lights are too bright or something. So I'm guessing we're okay. All right, so we've used this word identity provider, right? So the identity provider is what we're calling it in conversation, in the UI, in typical SharePoint. The actual name under the covers has got nothing to do, right? Site, web, site collection. So in PowerShell, it's called a trusted identity token issuer. And you need to add trusted identity token issuers to your SharePoint farm using PowerShell. There is no UI for adding these. Once they are added, you then enable them inside of central administration. So your end users aren't going through and doing all this, right? And so, see, this is the developer and me having slides that it's just 2 slides and then back on with our life. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to attempt to configure another identity provider on the fly. What I've done is there's a gentleman who works in the evangelism department at SharePoint, Vittorio Bartocci. He wrote the book on Windows Identity Foundation. He also wrote this wonderful little utility called self-STS. So I'm going to run self-STS, and I'll tell you why in a second. Let me get this running. So if you were to go look at ADFS to start it, it's free with purchase. You can run it on any machine any server in your domain. But when you're doing that, you have to configure inside ADFS. You need to configure the relying party. You need to configure the attribute store. You need to choose which attributes you're going to put in the token, all through a wizard in the MMC snap-in. It's not a simple task. This thing, however, has a green button that says Start. Perfect for a developer. I usually say it the other way around, by the way. One thing this also has is claim types and values. So I have a simple, very simple little box. Remember, developers don't write pretty stuff. It just works. So this box, I can then choose which claims this identity provider is going to offer. Self-STS helps me get practice with configuring these because I don't have to create a certificate. Self-STS will run on just plain old HTTP, so you'll never use it in production, right? I don't have to do any fancy wizards. I don't have to have a database store. I can go right here and I can just, and he's also got a pre-filled list of the different claims that you can offer. So that's why we love self-STS. So this is what's going on here. You can see it's just Joe Doe at test@company.com. So nothing fancy on here. I'm not going to change this. It is what it is. Now, the next thing you need to know when you're going to be creating identity provider, well, there's a couple things, right? So first of all, remember I log into the browser in SharePoint and I choose it from the list, and then it redirects me to a page to log in. SharePoint needs to know the address to which to send you. Self-STS has it right here. Here's the endpoint. And the C, you know what the C does? The C copies it to the clipboard so I can go paste it, right? In addition, there is a standard around the SAML WSFed that says I can have a document to describe the metadata of these tokens. It's called the Federation metadata. So I'm going to open this page here. I've got my favorites all set up here, so let me go into this and then my Federation metadata. And so here is the Federation metadata of my ADFS2 instance that's running on this domain. Again, this is an XML document that describes what's happening. A lot of gibberish in here that may make sense to some people. I'm going to collapse some of these down. You can see here that the token issuer needs to publish their public key because they're going to cryptographically sign the token, and the consumer of the token should validate the signature, right? Do the hash or whatever the mumbo jumbo is and make sure it's not messed with. So this metadata provides the key. And then it comes in and it's talking about what it's doing. This particular one has got, this descriptor is, so here it's giving us the WSFed. And then, oops, what did I do? Right here's the claim types requested. So ADFS is saying, I will give you the email address. I will give you the given name, or the name, or the UPN. All types of attributes that come out of Active Directory you can then present in the token, if you wish. They will be presented in the token. In SharePoint, we need to decide which ones we want. It's called mapping, and we'll do that step next. Right? So of all the claims that are offered by the issuer, which ones do I want to surface into SharePoint? You don't automatically get them all. You have to do one, which is the identifier. You're allowed to do more than one, as many as you want, or just the one. So that's federation metadata. I have another one here. Well, you know what? I'm just going to paste in my STS one. And if I look again here on the claims offered, so you can see it's a smaller list, and that matches that grid that Vittorio gave us, right? So you understand the concept here? Federation metadata will do this. Now, if I was using Visual Studio, I could just point a utility at that and suck them in and update something in Visual Studio automatically to say, here's all the claims that are offered. Sadly, there isn't one for SharePoint. That's a an ISV opportunity, I was told, which means someone should write code to do that, but I don't have the time. But so first thing I need to do is say, where are my tokens issued? I need the URL of how it's issued, where the browser should go to get them, and I need to know the metadata of what claims are being offered to me. I gather that information to provision my identity provider. I'm going to open up the Windows PowerShell ISE. It doesn't have recent files, so I'm going to then open a script I wrote. Oh, good Lord. You'd think I never used the mouse before the way I use this thing. So here's the PowerShell that will do this for me. And we'll walk through these steps, and then we'll run them and see if they work. Oh, so now I'm working on the SharePoint side, right? My STS is configured. If you're lucky, some partner organization is going to do it for you. You don't have to do anything with it. You just need to accept what they give you. First thing I need to do is I need to tell SharePoint to trust the certificate that's embedded in there, that X509 cert. I need to tell SharePoint to trust it. Number one gotcha. Well, not number one, but the first one. SharePoint does not use the certificate store of the operating system. SharePoint has more than one servers usually, so they put the cert in their own database. So you need to then add the certificate from that federation metadata into SharePoint. So I'm going to then read it into an object in PowerShell. That's line 1. Line 2, I'm going to map a claim. I'm mapping 2 claims, the email address and the surname. I want 2 of them in my token in SharePoint. And I'll show you why this is important a little bit later. That's lines 2 and line 3. Line 4 is the realm. The realm is something that SharePoint then sends to the token issuer to say, hey, this is who I am. The token issuer, that's called the identifying party. SharePoint's called the relying party. You can have an ADF instance or an identity provider who's servicing more than one clients, right? For example, Windows Azure ACS or Facebook or OpenID, they support lots of different consumers, if you will, relying parties. So SharePoint needs to send the realm, says, this is who I am. And the identity provider is going to validate that there is a relationship between the two before it will then answer. And then I'm also going to sign in URL. I need to tell SharePoint, when someone says they want to log in with this provider, I need to know where to send them to. So I send them to the sign-in URL. And then line 6 is the magic that happens. I create a new identifying provider. This name right here shows up in the dropdown. The description doesn't show up anywhere. And then I'm just going to pass in the realm, his certificate. I'm going to map the claims, and so on, right? So pretty straightforward stuff. Does this all make sense? Again, I heard all yeses because someone else spoke up. The question was, where did I specify that the email address is the identifying claim? On this the new SP Trusted Identity Token Issuer command, there's a parameter that says the identifier claim, and I set it as the input claim type of map1, and map1 it just happens to be the email. So the incoming claim type, input claim type is right here. So this email address is that's how I'm telling SharePoint, whatever they give you as the email address is how you identify them and create the SP user. If you see that email address again later, it's the same user. And now I'm going to run it and hope for the best. Hey, it worked. You have a question? Couldn't SharePoint provide those to its custom claim provider? What is those that you're referring to? Okay, so the SharePoint custom claims provider does 4 things and none of them are authentication. So the answer is no. Okay? That's kind of outside the scope, the claim provider, but basically the claim provider lets you choose claims to authorize people, and it can let you do a search on a list of users if you have that list available to you, but it won't do the authentication. So no, this mapping doesn't happen that way. Okay, so this works. So now next thing I want to do is log in using this, right? All right, I need to go to Central Administration. And I can never remember the port number. There it is, Application Management. So I have now used PowerShell to associate an identity provider with my farm. That's all it is. It's in my farm. If I want to use it, I need to specify in the web application settings which identity providers are to be used. So I'm going to manage web applications, and I choose the one that I'm interested in, and I do authentication provider. You can see here I have one zone, right? Multiple auths on one zone. So I'm going to click on the zone name, and I get this screen here that tells me Enable Windows Integrated, which I've turned off, FBA, and here's my trusted identity providers, and now I have a new one down here, right? I just added self-STS. So I can elect to choose that. I can then choose the default sign-in page, or I can have a custom one. And I can just, in order to have a custom one, someone will have to write it. You have to deploy it through a solution into your farm, and then you can point to it from here. All I'm doing is just ticking the box and I'm clicking save. Now this takes a little bit here. What's happening here while we're watching is it's updating the web.config of this zone to have the proper handlers and stuff for Windows Identity. Remember, SharePoint doesn't do authentication. The Windows Identity Framework does, so all kinds of stuff has to happen in there to describe the remote party and the token, understand the token, and map all the claims and do all the stuff. So that's what it's working on now. The question is that available to all the web apps? And by that you mean the identity provider? Yes. Yeah, any web application that's using claims instead of classic could now choose it from the list if they wanted to. Yes. All right, I'm rocking and rolling here, right? How about that? So let's log in. So I'm going to go to my home page for the claims demo, and it's probably going to remember who I logged in with before, so I'll have to close the browser. Although it might have done an IIS reset, so okay, good. So I dropped down the list, self-STS, right? Good to go, right? I didn't do the first thing I told you. The first gotcha I said I didn't do, did I? You need to tell SharePoint, put it in the thing. See, that was a trick. Y'all need to be paying attention. I said y'all because I'm in this area. I usually don't talk that way. In case you couldn't figure that out, right? So I have two choices. I can use PowerShell to have SharePoint trust this certificate, or I can do this on the security tab. It's this Manage Trust link, Manage Trust. And so here are all the ones from before, so I can just click New, and this lets me put in the name, any name I want. I like to make things match. There it is, and that's all I need to do. However, if you remember the yellow screen of death here, it said the root of the certificate chain is not trusted. Well, the self-STS has got a cert that doesn't have a parent. So if you get a certificate from some certificate authority, you need to make sure the parent's certificate is also added in the same screen. You got to go all the way up the chain until you get one of the top 6 or 7. And you security guys know what I'm talking about. The rest of you are just like me. But just keep going until you get it done, right? Until it works. So I refresh my page, and now I hope to be redirected to my self-STS. I should make sure it's running. It is, thank goodness. Now, the self-STS is not going to prompt me to log in. It automatically says, hey, you're Joe. I don't have Joe here. It's here. I have to just change it. See, it's test@company.com. Remember? In self-STS, that's what it said it was. So let me go to my claim viewer, the same page. We love this page. And so you can see here the trusted provider self-STS. I have 2 of them now. Because when I mapped this identity provider, remember I mapped 2 claims. So I have 2 of them that show up here. One is the email address, and one is the surname. Does that make sense? All right. And the demo worked. Woo! I usually don't write code live. I usually just copy-paste. So I put this in the slide deck. This is the same thing that I just showed you live, but those doing the recording may not want to see it. Basically, I need to I'm putting things into variables here. Basically, I'm building a bunch of variables so I can use it at the end. And so these are the 4 key pieces. The certificate, map the claims, set the realm, set the login URL, you're good to go. And again, this only puts it into the farm. This script does not update or enable it in any web application. To do the web application, you need to go in there and choose it, tick the box to make it work. Right? So when we're using claims in SharePoint, what's different? The user's login name is different. Here's the user's login name. 05.t pipe self-STS pipe test@company.com. Sometimes you see an I in there if I log in with a Windows identity. Let me show you that. Oh, I turned it off on this one. So what ends up happening here is, right, in the old days we knew it was domain /user, or it was FBA : their name. Well, those 2 still exist if you run in classic mode. If you're running in claims mode, you end up getting a concatenation of the Windows identity provider name in web.config, which by the default is I. See, I've messed around. And then after the I, you get some kind of, I'm not sure what 05T is. It's some internal message. I'm guessing this is the 5th one I've configured because I've been doing a lot of in and out. And then there's a pipe symbol. Then it has the name of the identity provider. It would be FBA before. Now it's self-STS. If I were to log in as one of the other ones, it would be that identity provider, and then a pipe, and then the identifier. So you can no longer make assumptions that it's always going to be an email address because I could map some unique ID to be, I could just put a number in there, right? Employee number 6, something like that. This applies more to your developers probably than you, but you need to understand. Okay? So that's what's different. That's new. You know what? And I don't want to flip back and forth, so let's go see what else is new. The people picker. I told you I was going to break the people picker. Let's go do that. This is fun. All right. So I am in a site, and I have a document library, and I'm going to modify the permissions of the document library, except I'm not logged in as someone who's allowed to change it, so let me change that. Oh, see, I knew it. I forgot to break something before I came in here. There was supposed to be 2 mistakes. Number 1 is the certificate. Number 2 is you need to grant people from that site access. I have a new identity provider, self-STS. How did Joe Doe at self-STS, how did he get permission to the site? I forgot to break it before I got here, so let me do that. I'm going to log in as the domain admin again here. Hey, it didn't prompt me. SharePoint sent me over to the ADFS in the domain. That's an IIS server. By default, sessions are 20 minutes. So it said, oh, I've seen you before. Here's your token. I'm back. That's good, right? It's good, right? Doggone right it's good. Actually, you know what? Let me go do site permissions. I did this at the top. So I'm going to go to the top level here, site permissions. And so what I did is claims in my visitors, I cheated and I said everyone who's authenticated is allowed to read. That's how they got in. Okay? But you see here now, as contributors, I have two different all users. See, it says all users from LT-VIRT and all users from the OpenID transition STS. So what does that mean? So when I'm doing permissions and I get to the people picker, this screen looks like it always has, but I can launch the people picker, and now I get lots of stuff here that looks different on the left-hand side. I have a tree view, and let me collapse these down and you'll see. Organizations has nothing here because I don't have the whole profile sync thing going on. Nothing's happening there. SharePoint groups works like you'd think, SharePoint groups. But you'll notice each of my identity providers is now showing up in the people picker. And in addition, I have all users. So this is all users. So I can then say anyone who comes in with a token from that identity provider is allowed in. So it's the equivalent of saying NT authority all authenticated users, but I can choose which identity provider. So in theory, you may want to say everyone from my local domain, but only certain people from extranets, right? Whatever the business scenario is. So, but what Betty in accounting is going to do is she's going to say, oh, I need to add Joe Doe from the self-STS. So she's going to type in Joe and click this button here. Wait a minute, where's Joe? Why don't I have Joe? Well, because there is no industry standard for an identity provider to share all the names of who's in there. In fact, if you go to Google or LiveID and say, will you give me a list of all your users, please? So the people picker has always worked because Microsoft wrote code that will search Active Directory. And the FBA providers have an API for searching or enumerating all users, and someone would write that code to do that. How am I going to do that in the claims world? So, a couple things I see happening. Number one, developers are writing a SharePoint claim provider to do the searching, and they're writing LDAP query code to search Active Directory to return a set of users. So in effect, they are rewriting the people picker. Very productive use of time. Another thing I'm seeing is people are saying, oh, we're not going to use claims because our end users can't use it. I swear, that's what there's going on, right? Or it's an education thing, right? So you need to teach them how this works and what this would mean. Question is, if you have a separate extranet for your people picker, separate web app for the extranet, can you hide the people picker? I don't know how to hide the people picker because I mean, think of all the places where you're allowed to set security. That's a lot of places to override, and I'm not so sure how to do that. I wouldn't want to, that's for certain. All right, so I'm going to expand these again here. Now you can see that the ADFS2 server shows two things, email address and group. And LT-Vert only has one email address. So each of the claims that are specified from the identity provider show up in the people picker. So the way the people picker is now going to work, it's not called the people picker anymore. It's called the claims expression editor, trademark. I made that up, so I got it right. Is that what I got to do? Trademark it? I don't know how to do the TM, whatever. And so remember I was getting from self-STS, I'm getting the surname. So in theory, I should be able to type in, well, it's Joe Doe, right? So if I type in Doe and I choose this, self-STS surname equals Doe. So now I can then grant permission to anyone who comes in from the self-STS provider with the surname equal to DOE, they're authorized. That makes sense, right? I can teach users that, right? How many users are in my self-STS provider? Okay. Oops, I hit the wrong button. See what happened there? I heard one uh-oh from a guy who knew this was coming. And remember what this is called? I am not picking people. I am entering claims expressions. So if I click this here, and I choose this, and I choose add, what I've just said is, if you get a token issued by self-STS, and the surname attribute in that token is equal to Schaefline, they're good to go. Makes perfect sense when you say it that way, right? But what does it say at the top of the dialog box? Select people and groups. So you can fix this with custom code, but it's still very difficult. In some scenarios, you would then need to query the remote provider of identity, and how practical is that? Or you need to trust them, right? So the third, right, people are rewriting code or they're not using claims. The other scenario that people are doing is they're restricting who's allowed to grant permission. So Betty in accounting may be the site collection administrator, but they tell her don't use the people picker. If you need something, send it to IT, and the IT people can then work with whoever the identity provider is to get the proper claim values and set this up correctly, right? And so you see here the people really is kind of strange stuff. It's really not all that interesting. Okay, what works and what does not work? So I get this question a lot. I've heard that when you put SharePoint in claims mode, blah, 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 it stops working. Okay? So I've asked people, I got the official answer, and I've got some unofficial answers, and I'm going to give you my experience, right? This is not an absolute. I asked, can I get a list of what works and what doesn't work? And I didn't get an answer, right? It makes sense. They're not going to tell you things don't work. But in general, here's the big things. User profile will work just fine. If you're importing user profile information from somewhere, and the unique identifier from profile is test@company.com, and there's a user test@company.com, it'll update, right? The user profile service runs as some service account in your farm, so it may not be able to talk to your partners to bring in their profile information, but if you get that information from them, it'll work just fine. The other big one is BCS. BCS works just fine. You want to do claims in BCS, it's a checkbox. Okay, it's a checkbox in SharePoint Designer. In Visual Studio, there's probably more to it, but if you're building a model in SharePoint Designer, I see a couple of head nods, but you can pass this on to your devs if you don't get this. When you're building the model in SharePoint Designer, you define a system, and the system has entities. When you define the connection to the system, there's a checkbox. Use claims. You check the box, you're good to go. And I have done many proofs of concept about a WCF service that's sending data. You make it claims aware using the Windows Identity Foundation classes, and it works just fine. And the other big one that I hear about is Power Pivot or Performance Point, whatever the two of the product name is these days, the BI tools. And the feedback I've gotten is when you're creating the reports, you need NT authentication. To run the reports doesn't matter. So yes, the performance tools work in claims mode, but you need to set it up in Windows NT mode. And to be honest, how many farms don't have Windows NT on one of the zones, right? So I think that's a manageable issue. Right? All right, the last thing you need to consider, his question is, if you're in classic mode, do you get claims? The answer is no, no claims. What claims thing are you talking about? There are no claims, no. So his question is, if I were to enumerate the claims and I'm in classic mode, there is no claims. There are no claims. I should use proper English. So now another thing that you may need to do. So it's possible that you want to access some service in your domain, whether it's a SharePoint service or some other resource on your domain, using it in claims mode. When you install SharePoint, you get this thing called the Claims to Windows Token Service. You can configure this that says anytime someone comes in with a valid claim and you decide what a valid claim is, it will automatically run under the identity of this service. It's a Windows service, not a SharePoint service. It's a Windows service that runs, and you can set the identity on that service. And the idea here is kind of like I'm running on behalf of someone else, delegated authentication. So if you give me a valid claim, then I'll go and talk to the service on your behalf, and I'll get the data back to you. That's generally how people used to talk to SQL Server back in the day, right? One account would always work, and you would just pass the data back on. So the claims to Windows token service is designed to help that. Now, me being a developer, I have no idea how to set that up, so you'll have to figure that out on your own. All right? Okay, so let me switch back. The question was, what about search? Does it build the ACL's property? Search has to run on a zone that has NTLM. So the search is not aware of the claims, so it will not security, no. Well, the rendering may work. I'd have to check into that, because the rendering, when you render it in SharePoint, now it's aware of the claims, so that might work for SharePoint content. If you're indexing file system content, I don't think that'll work. I think it will trim it. You'll never see it, is my guess. Because if it's a file share, it's got an ACL, and none of the claims people are on that ACL ever, so they won't see it. But if it's SharePoint content, it'll. So yes, it will security trim. If you're expecting to see stuff, you may not see it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just wondering SharePoint content.
SharePoint content will, yes, it'll work, right? Because the ACL has that claim expression, and it can evaluate that at runtime. I showed you the people picker. Other resources. Yeah, so these are all, again, this is for people, I get a lot of developers. We have developers in the room. Most of these sessions, the first two, I think, were yesterday, so you have to hit the recording. The Windows Azure is tomorrow. Windows, I guess they brought this up in the keynote, right? I really didn't hit the keynote for the whole time. But Windows Azure's control service basically lets you authenticate in the cloud. You go there and you say, I want a service, and I want my service to use Google and Yahoo and LiveID and Facebook. And in SharePoint, you trust Azure, and guess what? Facebook users come to your site. And if I had known that a week ago, I'd have showed it to you, but I wasn't about to change my demo last night, so I didn't bother to do that. Okay? So that's the end of my talk. I was expecting more problems. I didn't get problems. So I can do Q&A. I can try to go other authentication providers for you. Or you can go early to lunch, which in my experience is good for my ratings. Question in the back.